Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46, 56 degrees.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you all tonight. So I wanted to kind of start this opening for you all, just kind of getting us all oriented in the history of disaster film, where this film fits into that history, and how it potentially pushes us forward into a new climate era of film. So you heard a little bit about my background from Beth just now, but to give you a better idea of why I'm here and why you should listen to me on this topic, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I've become a disasterologist, a disaster researcher. So I got started doing disaster work in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina and the Levee Failure. I grew up in New England, but I went down to volunteer, ended up moving there, lived there for several years, working with a variety of nonprofits on recovery efforts. While I was there, the BP oil disaster happened, and the environmental groups that I was working with moved our work down to the coast to help with that more urgent response. I also started going around the country to other disasters that were happening, to Joplin, Missouri, to help with their recovery from the tornado, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to help with their tornado recovery. And as I went from place to place, there were two kind of major issues that really stuck out for me that were true of all of these different places across the country. The first was that there was widespread injustice in how the impacts from these disasters manifested across communities, and how various communities were able to access aid and help. Low-income communities, communities of color, other communities that had minimal political power had the most difficult time moving through recovery, getting the help that was needed. The second major issue that I saw repeated again and again was that there was kind of a reinventing the wheel of recovery in each of these places. I had this experience of being in New Orleans and spending a lot of time working out the best way to go about approaching recovery, and then when we'd go to a new community or a new state that had a disaster, it felt like those lessons weren't being implemented, and they were having to kind of start again from the beginning, which made that recovery process much more complicated than it probably needed to be. And so I started looking towards disaster research to see how that could be used as a tool for preventing disasters, dealing with some of these issues that existed in how we were responding and recovering to these various events. That led me to getting a doctoral degree in emergency management. I'm now an assistant professor at Mass Maritime, where I teach emergency management courses. I also spend a lot of time doing events like these, doing science communication, particularly related to the relationship between disasters and climate change. Disasters are very often how people can most easily see climate change manifest, and so helping us gain a better understanding of what that relationship looks like now and how we go about addressing it into the future is really important. And I also do a lot of work advocating for emergency management policy reform that looks at creating a more just approach to how we manage these disasters. I'm not really going to talk about very much of this tonight. Instead, I want to focus on some work that I've done related to disaster films. So hopefully these stills look familiar to you. These are from the movie Contagion. In January of 2020, right as people began to hear about this thing called COVID, a very interesting thing from a disaster research perspective happened, which is this decade-old movie, Contagion, bolted to the top of all of the streaming charts, the online rental charts. And what we now know was happening is that people were starting to hear this term pandemic used in the media, and they didn't know really what to do. Maybe you are among them, didn't really know what to do or what to think about this potential pandemic. And so many people turned to Hollywood. They turned to this film, Contagion, to try and understand what was maybe about to happen. From a disaster research perspective, that potentially is a little scary because this is a fictional movie, and if you have spent any time watching disaster films, you may have known that those films are not always accurate portrayals of what actually happens during disasters. So this idea that the public's kind of collective reaction, this wasn't just in the US, this was a global reaction, was to turn to Hollywood in this moment of anxiety, in this moment of crisis, was a real signal to us as disaster researchers that maybe we need to be paying a bit more attention to what is actually happening in these Hollywood disaster films, so that we can understand what the public is taking away from them. So when we think from this research perspective of what we care about most here, right, there's the kind of spectacle and the entertainment value of disaster films. But even going back to the founders of our discipline, the founders of disaster research, they were talking about how these films shaped public perception, how these films can inform the public's knowledge of disaster, how these films can help us process real-life disasters that happen, make them more understandable, like we saw with the pandemic as we were kind of channeling our collective anxieties into watching this movie Contagion to help show us what was about to come. And this is potentially really useful, again, if those films are showing an accurate portrayal of how we respond to disasters. When the pandemic began, myself and one of my colleagues, John Carr, another disaster researcher, we started to look into what research had been done recently on disaster films, and we found that there had been almost nothing, a handful of studies in the past 20 years on this topic. And so we began our pandemic research project, as I'll call it, where we decided to look at the disaster films of the past 20 years in a very systematic way to see what content was in those films, what people were learning from those films. So over the span of about 9 months, we watched 170 disaster films, which is a journey, let me tell you. We watched everything from, these top billing movies like The Day After Tomorrow down to these very, very, very low budget disaster films that are truly a spectacle in and of themselves, to see what they were saying. And we found some interesting things. One of our major findings was that there was almost no mention of climate change in any of these films. Explicit mentions of climate change, there were about 5 out of 170 films. There were a couple films where you might argue they were an allegory or a metaphor for climate change, but it was really minimal, which I think is a really interesting finding in the context of this film that you're about to watch. I will be very careful not to give any spoilers in case you haven't seen it. But the director, Adam McKay of Don't Look Up, has stated very clearly in the interviews and the marketing surrounding the film that this is a film about climate change, that the comet that comes towards Earth is this allegory for climate change and political inaction on climate change. And so as we think about these various anxieties that we are living with today, whether it is the pandemic, which I think also comes through very clearly in this film, or the situation in Ukraine, various disasters happening around the world, or climate change itself, it's important to look towards Hollywood, how Hollywood is interpreting these anxieties, how they are showing them on screen. The other thing that I wanted to point out here too is that Don't Look Up has really been billed as the climate movie or one of the first climate movies. But as a disaster researcher, I may be a bit biased here, but I think it's important to look at it as a disaster film as well, and where it falls within this much broader lineage of disaster film, these various movie cycles that we have been through, usually in, these are rough estimates here, but usually in cycles of 20 years, we've seen shifts in how Hollywood depicts disaster, which real-life anxieties Hollywood picks up on to display in these films. So dating back to the early 1900s, you see the majority of disaster films are largely centered around these biblical epics. A few mixed in there related to the Chicago fire or the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. You then see the shift towards the risk of nuclear war. You see these survivalist, post-apocalyptic fiction type films like The Day After. Later, you see Dr. Strangelove. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the modern-day environmental movement begins to come about, you start to see more eco-catastrophe type films. You see the shift in the 80s and 90s towards these disaster action films. Coming out of the 1970s, The Towering Inferno, largely not even necessarily tied to real-life anxieties, but due to advances in technology, the ability to show these more complicated spectacles on screen. And then we see the post-9/11 era, which we are in the process of coming out of, where there is this emphasis on terrorism, on homeland security type complexes. You see a lot of gun grabs, right? When disasters happens, everybody's grabbing their guns. That is a holdover of the kind of post-9/11 anxiety. I would argue, or have you think about, where Hollywood is now in terms of climate change, and as climate change becomes a bigger anxiety, as we begin to see more climate-related disasters manifest around the world, as we clarify the science surrounding climate change and become more clear about what the real-life impacts of climate are and will continue to be, it makes sense that climate change is kind of the next era for Hollywood disaster films. There are certainly a couple over the past several years that you can look back on and that we could term climate films. The Day After Tomorrow. We have Beasts of the Southern Wild taking place on a fictional Gulf Coast. You have Snowpiercer. In the past year, we've had Greenland, another film that used a comet as a bit of an allegory for global catastrophe. But perhaps Don't Look Up is one of the first major films that has really been so explicit in its marketing surrounding the film to bill itself as this big Hollywood climate movie. You'll notice in the film that the words climate change are never said. It is all based on an audience really making those connections on their own to lead to whether or not people take away from this movie that it is a climate movie. And so I'll end here with my favorite protest sign, strongly identify with it, to just have you think about as you watch the movie and you think about kind of our current reality, our many current anxieties of where Don't Look Up as a film actually leaves us. How does it lead us to a call to action? Does it lead us to doomerism? I hope it's a call to action, and that this film can be used in this really powerful way to wake people up and change people's perspective of the urgency of addressing climate change.